The limousines were already lined up along Meeting Street by the time the first stars appeared over Charleston Harbor. A warm April breeze carried the scent of jasmine through the wrought iron gates of the Magnolia Grand Hotel, one of the oldest and most celebrated landmarks in South Carolina. A building that had witnessed cotton merchants, Reconstruction politicians, civil rights marches, and now, on this particular Thursday evening, the kind of gathering that made headlines before the dessert was even served. The Magnolia Grand had been built in 1887, and its ballroom had hosted presidents, governors, and decorated generals. Its marble floors were polished to a mirror finish every morning by a staff of 20. Its chandeliers, each one imported from Vienna and holding over 400 crystal pieces, threw warm golden light across the high ceilings and made every woman in an evening gown look like she had stepped out of a painting. It was the kind of place that made people stand a little straighter just by walking through the door. Tonight, the hotel was hosting the annual Veterans Legacy Gala, organized by the Bennett Foundation, one of the most respected philanthropic organizations in the American Southeast. The foundation had spent 30 years building programs that supported retired military personnel, funding mental health initiatives, job placement services, housing assistance, and college scholarships for the children of men and women who had sacrificed their best years in service to the country. Every year, the gala brought together the most powerful people in South Carolina and beyond. Politicians, executives, real estate developers, hedge fund managers, retired generals, and community leaders all gathered in the same room, checkbooks open, cameras ready, egos carefully arranged like centerpieces on the tables. The invitation list was curated with surgical precision by Olivia Bennett herself, the 46-year-old president of the foundation who had inherited the organization from her father and spent the better part of 2 decades transforming it into something that actually changed lives, rather than simply providing wealthy people with a tax-advantaged evening out. Olivia was sharp, gracious, and deeply respected. She had a talent for making every guest feel like the most important person in the room, while simultaneously ensuring that the foundation's mission remained the center of attention. She wore a navy blue gown that evening, her dark hair pulled back, a small American flag pin on her shoulder. By 7 o'clock, the grand entrance hall was filling with the kinds of people who made ordinary citizens step aside on sidewalks. Senator Thomas Green arrived first, which was typical of him. At 59, the senator from South Carolina carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had spent 4 years in the United States Navy before spending 3 decades in Washington. He was broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and wore his dress uniform rather than a tuxedo, which was his way of reminding everyone in the room what the evening was actually supposed to be about. He shook hands firmly and remembered names without being reminded of them. People gravitated toward him the way people gravitate toward warmth on a cold night. Behind the senator came the wave of executives, venture capitalists from Charlotte and Atlanta, a pharmaceutical heiress from Columbia, a tech entrepreneur who had sold 2 startups before turning 40, a commercial real estate developer from Miami who was in talks to build a mixed-use luxury tower on the Charleston waterfront. Their conversations blended together in the marble entrance hall, words like portfolio and acquisition and quarterly projections drifting through the air alongside the scent of expensive cologne and even more expensive perfume. And then came Richard Coleman. He arrived in a black Rolls-Royce Ghost, which meant he arrived 3 minutes after the car had already pulled up and the driver had been waiting for him to finish a phone call. He was 62 years old, with the kind of tan that comes not from working outdoors, but from vacationing in places most people will never see. He wore a custom-made tuxedo from a Savile Row tailor in London, cufflinks that caught the chandelier light and announced their value without subtlety, and an expression that suggested he was perpetually deciding whether the room he had just entered was worthy of his presence. Richard Coleman had made his money in commercial real estate across the American South and Midwest. His name was on towers in Nashville, Birmingham, and Jacksonville. He had been profiled in Forbes twice, featured in a documentary about the new American real estate boom, and had recently made news by purchasing an island off the coast of Georgia for reasons that were never entirely clear but were widely discussed. He was not a bad man in the way that truly dangerous people are bad. He was bad in the smaller, quieter way that wealth and admiration and the constant absence of honest feedback can make a person bad. He had surrounded himself for so long with people who laughed at his jokes and agreed with his opinions and validated his worldview that he had gradually lost the ability to distinguish between respect and flattery. He genuinely believed that he could read a person's worth in their shoes. He greeted Senator Green with practiced warmth, pumped hands with two executives he recognized, kissed the cheek of a philanthropist from Greenville he had met at a similar event 6 months prior, and then allowed a hotel staff member to escort him to his seat at the main table, the large round centerpiece table in the middle of the ballroom that had been reserved for the event's most distinguished guests. He was still reviewing the seating arrangement when he noticed the man already seated to his left. The man was wearing a dark navy suit, not bespoke, not Italian, not the kind of suit that announces itself. It was clean and well pressed, but it was the kind of suit you could buy at a good department store during a sale. His shoes were polished black Oxfords, sturdy and simple. He wore no watch that Richard could see, and his only accessory was a small round lapel pin that Richard did not immediately recognize. His hands rested quietly on the table in front of him. His posture was straight but relaxed, the posture of a man who had spent years being told when to stand and when to sit, and had never lost the habit of doing both correctly. He appeared to be in his late 50s. His hair was close-cropped and showed silver at the temples. His face was calm, the kind of calm that comes not from indifference, but from having seen enough of the world to no longer be easily disturbed by it. He was a black man, and he was sitting at the main table of the most exclusive charitable event in Charleston, South Carolina, and he looked to Richard Coleman like someone who had wandered in through the wrong door. Richard sat down. He straightened his cufflinks. He took a sip of water and looked around the table at the faces he recognized. The senator, the pharmaceutical heiress, two other executives, Olivia Bennett's empty chair, and then his gaze returned to the man in the navy suit. The man glanced over. He had dark, attentive eyes. He nodded once, a brief, genuine acknowledgement. "Good evening," the man said. His voice was low and even. "Evening," Richard replied. And then, because he was Richard Coleman and because he had never learned the value of keeping certain thoughts to himself, he said, "I don't think we've been introduced. Are you with the hotel staff?" The man looked at him for a moment. There was no flash of anger in his eyes, no flicker of offense, just a steady, patient calm. "I'm a guest," the man said. "Of course," Richard said, smiling in the way that people smile when they want to make a statement without being held accountable for the words. "Of course you are. I just didn't recognize you, that's all. I thought I knew most of the people at this table." "David Brooks," the man said, and extended his hand. Richard shook it. "Richard Coleman," he replied, and waited for the recognition that his name typically produced. A widening of eyes, a straightening of posture, a comment about the Nashville Tower or the Georgia Island. There was none of that. David Brooks shook his hand with a firm, unhurried grip, and then settled back in his chair and picked up the event program that had been placed on each plate. Richard Coleman watched him for a moment and then turned away, already forming the story he would tell later. Something about the foundation letting just anyone into these events now. Something about the quality of the guest list declining. He would frame it as a concern about the foundation's standards. He was good at framing things. At the front of the ballroom, Olivia Bennett appeared at the edge of the room, speaking quietly with a staff member. She glanced toward the main table, saw David Brooks seated comfortably with the event program in his hands, and allowed herself a small, private smile. She had known David for 11 years. She knew exactly who was sitting at that table, and she knew that the evening ahead was going to be one that people in Charleston would be talking about for a very long time. She straightened her flag pin and walked toward the podium to welcome her guests. The appetizers arrived at 7:30, carried with practiced efficiency by the hotel's catering staff, small plates of she-crab soup, a Charleston tradition, followed by butter-poached shrimp on a bed of stone-ground grits from a mill in the Lowcountry that had been operating since before the Civil War. The tables were set with white linen and tall candles, and the soft sound of a live jazz quartet drifted from the corner of the room, understated enough not to interrupt conversation, but present enough to fill the silences. David Brooks accepted his soup with a quiet thank you to the server, a young man who looked to be in his early 20s and who had been visibly nervous all evening, spilling a small amount of water near one of the other tables earlier and spending the rest of the hour trying to recover his composure. David had noticed this when he arrived. He had also noticed the young man's name tag and had used his name, Marcus, when thanking him, which caused Marcus to pause for just a fraction of a second before nodding and moving on. Richard Coleman, seated to David's left, had accepted his soup without looking at the server. The conversation at the main table opened in the way conversations at these events always open, with the currency of names and numbers. Someone mentioned a development project in Myrtle Beach. Someone else mentioned a portfolio rebalancing. Senator Green spoke briefly about new legislation he was co-sponsoring that would expand mental health services for veterans in rural counties, and the table listened with genuine interest because the senator had a way of making policy sound like something that happened to real human beings rather than something that happened in congressional committees. Richard Coleman listened to all of this with the posture of a man who was simultaneously engaged and calculating, turning each piece of information into a potential opportunity or a potential threat, sorting people into categories of useful and irrelevant. His eyes moved around the table with practiced efficiency. He asked a question about the Myrtle Beach project that showed he already knew most of the answer. He made a comment about defense contracting that drew a polite response from one of the retired military officers seated 2 chairs away. Then, as the soup plates were being cleared and the conversation shifted naturally in the way that table conversations do, he turned back to David Brooks. David was watching the jazz quartet with quiet interest. There was nothing performative about his attention. He was simply listening in the way that people who have learned to be present in the moment listen, fully and without distraction. "So David," Richard said, dropping into the familiar first-name usage that people with power use when they want to establish hierarchy, "what brings you to an event like this? Do you have family in the military?" David turned from the quartet and looked at Richard with that same steady calm. "I served," he said. Richard raised an eyebrow slightly. "Army? Marines?" "Army," David said. "How long?" 28 years. Richard nodded, doing the quick arithmetic that people do when they learn someone's years of service. The brief mental calculation that produces a vague impression of dedication without any real understanding of what those years contain. "Good for you," he said, in the tone of someone handing out a participation ribbon. "The country needs people willing to do that. Not everyone has the right fit for it." He smiled, a smile that said he considered himself among those who had found more valuable things to do with their 28 years. "It was the right fit for me," David said simply. "And now, after the Army, I mean, what do you do with yourself?" The question had a particular texture to it. Not hostile, not yet, but carrying the faint implication that whatever David Brooks did after the Army was something Richard Coleman would need to evaluate before deciding how much attention to extend to the conversation. "I run a company," David said. "What kind of company?" "Technology and defense contracting," David said. Richard nodded again, this time with the faint condescension of a man who has dealt with many small contractors and knows how to categorize them. "Government work," he said. "Good steady income in that. Not glamorous, but steady." He took a sip of his water. "How many employees?" David considered the question for a moment, not because he did not know the answer, but because he appeared to be deciding how much of the answer was worth sharing. "Enough," he said. Richard smiled, this time with a sharper edge. "Enough," he repeated, as if the word confirmed something he had already suspected. "Well, that's a start." He looked around the table briefly, then back at David. "I have to ask, and forgive me if this comes across the wrong way, but how does someone get a seat at this particular table? I've been coming to this event for 6 years, and the main table is usually reserved for the top donors and the foundation board." He paused deliberately. "No criticism of the foundation, of course. Olivia does extraordinary work. I just want to make sure the right people are recognized." The table had gone slightly quieter. Not completely. Conversations were still moving at the edges, but the people closest to Richard and David had registered the shift in the conversation's temperature. David set down his water glass carefully. He looked at Richard Coleman with those dark, patient eyes, and Richard felt something that he rarely felt in these situations, which was the faint and uncomfortable sense that he had misjudged the distance between himself and another person. "I was invited," David said. "Naturally," Richard said quickly. "Of course. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise." But the smile on his face said something different from his words, and everyone at the table who was paying attention could see the gap between the two. Senator Green, 3 chairs away, had been watching this exchange with the particular attentiveness of a man who has spent 40 years in institutions built on hierarchy and learned to recognize when someone was being used as a prop for another person's ego. His expression remained neutral. He picked up his fork and began eating the shrimp and grits that had just arrived, and said nothing yet, because he was also a man who knew the value of waiting for the right moment. Olivia Bennet had returned to the table by this point and was seated 2 chairs to David's right. She had heard enough of the exchange to understand where it was heading. She kept her expression composed and her attention divided between the conversation and her phone, on which she was reviewing the evening's program schedule. Inside, she was making calculations of a different kind, about timing, about what the evening deserved, and about the particular satisfaction of allowing certain situations to unfold at their own pace, rather than interrupting them prematurely. The main course arrived. Prime rib for those who had requested it, a pan-seared sea bass for others, accompanied by roasted heirloom vegetables from a farm outside Somerville, and a reduction sauce that had been prepared by the hotel's executive chef, a man who had trained in New York and New Orleans and brought both cities with him to every plate he produced. The room filled briefly with the kind of appreciative silence that good food produces. Richard Coleman cut into his prime rib and resumed. "You know," he said, addressing the table in a manner that used the plural but was clearly directed at David, "one of the things I've noticed about events like this is that they've become much more inclusive in recent years, which is admirable, truly. It's important to represent different communities, different backgrounds." He paused, dabbing his mouth with his linen napkin. "But I do think there's a certain responsibility that comes with the format. When you're at a table like this, you represent something. You're making a statement about who belongs in these conversations." The table was quiet now. The pharmaceutical heiress to Richard's right had stopped eating. One of the retired military officers at the far end of the table had looked up from his plate. David Brooks had not stopped eating. He finished a bite of sea bass, placed his fork down quietly, and looked at Richard with an expression that was completely unhurried and completely unreadable in terms of anger, because there was none to read. What was there instead was something older and more difficult to name. The calm of a man who has been tested in ways that made this particular moment feel very, very small. "I agree with you," David said. Richard blinked. He had not expected agreement. "Representation matters," David continued. "The people in a room like this send a message about what the room values. You're right about that." He picked up his fork again. "The question is always whether the room is measuring value by the right standard." The silence stretched for 2 full seconds, which in a room full of people accustomed to controlling conversations felt considerably longer. Richard Coleman opened his mouth, closed it, and then reached for his wineglass with a hand that was not quite as steady as it had been 30 seconds earlier. He laughed, a social laugh, the kind that fills space without committing to a position. "Well said," said Senator Green quietly from down the table, without looking up from his plate. The jazz quartet shifted to a slower song. Somewhere across the ballroom, a woman laughed at something her companion had said. The candles flickered briefly as a door opened somewhere near the kitchen, and David Brooks finished his dinner with the quiet, undisturbed appetite of a man who had eaten field rations in temperatures that this room would never understand, and who had learned long ago that a good meal, wherever it came from, was something worth being grateful for. By the time the dessert menus were placed on the tables, Richard Coleman had settled into a rhythm. It was a rhythm that the people around him recognized, the particular cadence of a man who had decided that the evening belonged to him, and who was going to make that decision apparent to everyone present. He had told 2 stories during the main course, one about a negotiation he had conducted in Dubai the previous year in which he had outmaneuvered a sovereign wealth fund, and another about a dinner he had attended at a private club in Manhattan where he had sat next to a former Secretary of the Treasury. Both stories were told with the practiced ease of a man who has told them many times, refined them in the telling, filed down the rough edges, and amplified the moments in which Richard Coleman emerged as the most perceptive, the most decisive, the most indispensable person in the room. The executives at the table listened with the professional attentiveness that people in business learn to perform even when they are not genuinely interested. The pharmaceutical heiress smiled at appropriate moments. Senator Green ate his dessert. David Brooks had listened to both stories without comment, which seemed to irritate Richard in the way that silence always irritates people who are performing. Silence does not provide the friction that performance requires. It simply receives what is offered and gives nothing back, which is its own kind of power. "You seem very quiet, David," Richard said eventually, as the dessert plates, warm peach cobbler with bourbon vanilla ice cream, were distributed across the table. Not much of a talker? I talk when I have something worth saying, David replied. Richard smiled with his teeth. A man of action, then. I can respect that. He leaned back slightly in his chair. Though I have to say, in business, the ability to communicate is everything. The ability to present yourself, to hold a room, to make people understand your vision. That's what separates the people who build things from the people who work on the things other people build. He said it smoothly, with just enough pleasantness coating the surface that it could be denied later if necessary. Building and serving both have dignity, David said. He did not say it defensively. He said it the way a person states a fact they have long since finished arguing about. Across the table, Marcus, the young server, had arrived to pour coffee. His hand was steady now, steadier than it had been earlier in the evening. He had recovered his composure by degrees through the night, and something about the calm at this particular end of the table seemed to have helped. He poured David's coffee first, as David was closest, and David glanced up with a brief nod. "Thank you, Marcus," David said. Marcus paused. He had been serving this table for 90 minutes, and no one else had used his name. "Yes, sir," he said. "Thank you, sir." Richard watched this exchange with something between amusement and impatience. "You know the staff?" he asked. "I read his name tag when I sat down," David said. Richard studied him. Habit from the military? Habit from believing that every person in a room deserves to be acknowledged, David said. The response landed without aggression, without performance, without any indication that David was making a point at Richard's expense. He was simply stating the principle he operated by, the way you state the temperature or the time. Richard, to his credit or perhaps to his limitation, seemed genuinely uncertain how to respond to someone who said such things without apparent effort or calculation. He tried a different approach. "Tell me about your company," Richard said, affecting the tone of a man generously extending an opportunity. "Defense contracting? Who are your primary clients? Are we talking local government contracts, state level? Or are you working with federal agencies?" "We work with several federal agencies," David said. "Prime contractor or subcontractor?" "Prime." Richard nodded slowly, recalibrating slightly. Prime contractors were not nothing, but there were many of them, companies of all sizes operating across the defense landscape, and without knowing the scale, the word prime meant very little. "Revenue range?" he asked, and the bluntness of the question was covered by the casual authority of a man who asks such things routinely and expects answers. David looked at him steadily. "We're private," he said. "We don't disclose financials publicly." Of course, Richard said. "Ballpark, though. Are we talking a $10 million operation? 20? I ask, because I'm always interested in understanding the landscape, the ecosystem, you know." "I understand what you're asking," David said, "and I think the honest answer is that the number wouldn't tell you what you actually want to know." Richard blinked. "And what do I actually want to know?" "Whether I belong at this table," David said. Not with anger, not with accusation. With the straightforward clarity of a man naming a thing so that it can be properly examined. The table had gone completely quiet. The jazz quartet was between songs. In the brief silence, the sound of the wider ballroom drifted over them, the laughter of 600 people, the clink of glassware, the low hum of an event proceeding as designed. But at this table, at this particular corner of the evening, time had slowed. Richard Coleman's face went through 3 changes in quick succession. First, the reddening of a man who has been caught. Second, the tightening of a man who does not intend to admit to being caught. Third, the reconstruction of the social smile, the practiced, durable shield that men like Richard keep polished for exactly these moments. "That's a strong reading of a perfectly reasonable question," Richard said. His voice was controlled, but there was a brittleness to it now, a quality of something under pressure. "Perhaps," David said. He picked up his coffee and took a slow sip. "But I've had enough dinners to know the difference between curiosity and auditing." Senator Green set down his coffee cup. He looked at David Brooks for a moment with an expression that had passed through recognition and arrived somewhere deeper, the look of one man of a certain kind of history looking at another. He said nothing, but the look said a great deal. Olivia Bennet glanced at the clock at the far end of the ballroom. It was 8:45. The formal program was scheduled to begin at 9. She smoothed her napkin in her lap and looked briefly at David, who was looking at no one in particular now, His gaze settled somewhere in the middle distance with an expression of absolute ease, the ease of a man who is not waiting for anything because he already knows what the evening holds. She thought about all the calls she had received from David over the years, always made from a private number, always concluding with his standard instruction, "Keep my name off the materials." She thought about the morning 11 years ago when she had first met him in a conference room in Columbia, when she had walked in expecting a meeting with a foundation board member and had instead found herself across the table from a man who proceeded to lay out, over the course of 3 hours, the most comprehensive and rigorously funded veteran support initiative she had ever encountered, and who had ended the meeting by writing a check that she still, to this day, could feel the weight of in her hands. She thought about all of this, and she thought about Richard Coleman, who had been coming to this event for 6 years and donating an amount that was generous in the way that tax deductions are generous, and who spent those 6 evenings networking his way through the ballroom in a manner that suggested the foundation was a backdrop for his social performance rather than the reason for his presence. She looked at the clock again. 14 minutes. The dessert plates were being cleared. The coffee was being refreshed. Across the ballroom, the evening's program director was making final adjustments to the podium microphone. The chandeliers above the main table threw their warm, indiscriminate light across everyone equally, across the senator and the heiress and the executives and the servers, and the man in the custom tuxedo and the man in the navy suit. And the light did not distinguish between them, which the light never does. Richard Coleman was explaining to the executive on his right the mechanics of a refinancing deal he had recently completed on a mixed-use development in Chattanooga. His voice had recovered its full confidence. He had filed the previous exchange under the category of conversations with people who had not understood the spirit in which his questions had been intended and had moved on in the efficient manner of men who do not permit discomfort to linger. David Brooks was watching the room. He watched it the way a person watches a place they love, not with ownership or nostalgia, but with the quiet attention of someone who understands what a gathering of people represents and takes it seriously. He watched a young couple near the far wall, both in their 20s, both in dress uniforms, standing a little stiffly at the edge of a conversation with older guests and not yet comfortable in the room. He made a mental note of them. He made a lot of mental notes in the course of an evening that most people spent simply experiencing. 9 o'clock arrived. The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly. The jazz quartet finished their final number, and applause rippled through the room. At the podium, Olivia Bennett adjusted the microphone, looked out at 600 people arranged before her in the warm golden light of the Magnolia Grand Ballroom, and began to speak. "Good evening," Olivia said, and her voice carried through the ballroom with the quiet authority of someone who had spent years earning the right to hold a room's attention without demanding it. The conversation settled. The clink of glassware diminished. 600 faces turned toward the podium, and the Magnolia Grand became, for a moment, the kind of room that makes you aware of your own breathing. 22 veterans take their own lives every day in the United States of America. She let that sentence rest in the air for a full 3 seconds without following it. Not 22 a month, not 22 a year, every day. And for most of us in this room, that number passes through our awareness the way most devastating statistics do, noted, mourned briefly, and then set aside because the distance between the number and our daily lives makes it too large to hold on to. She paused again. The Bennett Foundation was started by my father 30 years ago because he believed that the distance between that number and our daily lives was a choice, not an inevitability. He believed that if we chose to close that distance, we could. And the evidence, gathered over 3 decades and expressed in the lives of thousands of veterans and their families who have accessed our programs, is that he was right. The room was completely still. Senator Green in his uniform had his hands folded on the table in front of him and was looking at the podium with an expression that people who have lost friends to the statistic Olivia had just cited carry in their faces like a watermark, always present, rarely discussed. David Brooks was listening with his hands resting in his lap and his eyes on Olivia. His expression was attentive and composed, but something moved beneath the surface of it, something familiar and private, the recognition of a man for whom the 22 was not a statistic, but a count of people he had known or come close to knowing. Richard Coleman was listening with his professional attentiveness engaged, the look of a man at a presentation who has not yet decided whether the presentation is worth his continued attention. Olivia spoke for 12 minutes. She described the foundation's work with precision and without sentimentality, citing specific programs, specific outcomes, specific human beings whose trajectories had changed because of the organization's intervention. A veteran in Spartanburg who had been living in his car, who was now employed and housed and studying for his electrician's certification. A woman in Beaufort who had returned from 2 tours in Afghanistan with post-traumatic stress disorder so severe that she had been unable to hold a job for 3 years, who was now working as a peer support counselor for other veterans at the same facility that had helped her. A young man in Colombia whose father had died of suicide the year after returning from service and who was now, at 19, studying on a full scholarship funded by the foundation, the first in his family to attend college. Each story was told briefly, with care, without exploitation. Each story was its own argument for why the room had gathered. When Olivia finished the program overview, she transitioned to the evening's acknowledgments. She thanked Senator Green, who nodded from the main table. She thanked the hotel, the catering staff, the volunteers, the board members. She thanked the media representatives present, and she thanked the evening's corporate sponsors, a list of names that Richard Coleman listened to with his chin slightly lifted, waiting for his own name, which arrived in its appropriate alphabetical position and was acknowledged with a nod from him that the room was too large for most people to notice. And then Olivia paused. She looked down at her notes, though everyone who knew her understood that she did not need notes for this part of the evening. "The Bennett Foundation has a tradition," she said, "of honoring what we call the quiet pillar. The quiet pillar is the recognition we extend each year to an individual whose contribution to our mission has been extraordinary and sustained, and by their own specific and consistent request, entirely anonymous." The room murmured. People shifted in their seats. At the main table, the pharmaceutical heiress leaned slightly forward. Senator Green unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the table. Richard Coleman looked at Olivia with renewed attention. "I have had the privilege of knowing this year's recipient for 11 years, Olivia said. "In those 11 years, he has never once requested recognition. He has never asked for his name on a building, on a program, on a website, on a press release. He has, in fact, actively resisted all of these things on every occasion that I or anyone on my team has attempted to offer them." She smiled briefly, the smile of genuine memory. "He once told me that if his name was on a program, then the program would become about him, and that was not why he funded it." The murmur in the room deepened. This year, for the first time, he agreed to be acknowledged publicly. Not because he wanted recognition, but because, and I am quoting him here, he felt that the veterans and families who benefit from these programs deserve to know that someone in the private sector sees them and considers their service a debt of honor rather than a line item in a corporate social responsibility report. Complete silence. "This individual," Olivia continued, "is a veteran of the United States Army, having served for 28 years and retiring at the rank of colonel in the Special Forces. Following his military career, he founded a private technology and defense company that has grown to become one of the largest of its kind in the country. Over the past 11 years, he has provided the Bennett Foundation with funding totaling over $90 million. The silence in the room changed its quality. It became the kind of silence that $90 million produces in a room full of people who understand what $90 million means. He has funded 237 college scholarships for the children of veterans. He has built or renovated 4 mental health clinics in underserved rural counties in South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia. He has established a job placement program that has placed over 1,400 veterans into full-time employment in the past 7 years. All of it, every cent and every program and every brick and every scholarship check, has carried someone else's name. A foundation name, a program name. Never his." Olivia looked up from the podium and looked directly at the main table. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored tonight to introduce to you, for the very first time in this public setting, Colonel David Brooks." The silence lasted for precisely 4 seconds. Then Senator Thomas Green rose to his feet. He did not wait to see who else would stand. He simply rose, and in the United States of America, in a room full of people who have any understanding at all of what 28 years of service in the United States Army Special Forces means, Senator Green's standing was all the permission anyone needed. The room followed him up. 600 people rose from their tables in the ballroom of the Magnolia Grand Hotel And the applause that began was not the polite, event-appropriate applause that people offer when they are supposed to applaud. It was the other kind, the kind that starts in the chest before it reaches the hands, the kind that a room produces when it has been surprised into genuine feeling. David Brooks sat at the main table for a moment without moving. This was not the stillness of a man overwhelmed. It was the stillness of a man who had spent a great deal of his life deciding how to respond to moments that required him to accept something he had not sought, and who had developed over the course of those years the quiet practice of receiving such moments with grace rather than deflection. He stood. He was not a tall man, but he stood in the way that certain people stand, with a quality of presence that has nothing to do with height, the result of 2 decades and more of learning to occupy space with full accountability for what that space contained. He looked at the room. He did not wave. He did not perform gratitude. He nodded, once, slowly, and the nod contained everything a boo or a wave might have contained without any of the theater. And then he looked at Olivia, and the look he gave her was the look of a man who trusted someone enough to allow them to be right about something he had been wrong about for a long time, which is one of the rarest kinds of trust there is. At the main table, Richard Coleman had risen with the rest of the room because not rising would have been noticed, and because Richard Coleman understood optics, even when he did not understand the moment that had created them. He was clapping with his hands, but his face was doing something different from clapping, something that moved through confusion and arrived at a place that was harder to name, a place where the architecture of a belief system meets the evidence that it is structurally unsound. He had spent 3 hours at this table deciding who David Brooks was. He had used the tools he always used: clothes, diction, the surface of a person, the currency of names and numbers that he deployed as diagnostic instruments, and he had rendered his verdict with the confidence that came from never having been seriously wrong before. Or rather, from never having been shown that he was seriously wrong before, which is a different thing entirely. Now he stood in a room of 600 people applauding a man he had spent the evening attempting to diminish, and the gap between what he had assumed and what was true opened beneath him like a distance he had not known he was standing over. Olivia invited David to the podium. He moved through the room without hurry, stopping briefly at 2 different tables to shake hands, once with a man in a wheelchair who was a retired Army sergeant from Myrtle Beach who had been attending the gala for 4 years, and once with the young couple David had noticed earlier in the evening, the 2 in dress uniforms standing slightly outside the warmth of the older guests' conversations. He said something to each of them that no one else could hear, and both the sergeant and the young couple responded with the particular expression of people who have just been seen in the way they needed to be seen. He reached the podium. He adjusted the microphone. He looked out at the room for a moment, at the 600 people still on their feet, and the look on his face was the look of a man counting something that has value he cannot fully express. "Please sit down," he said. "I mean that with complete respect and complete sincerity. Please sit down." The room sat. He placed both hands on the podium, not gripping it, simply resting them there, as if the podium were a table and he were simply having a conversation with everyone in the room at once. "I want to say 3 things," he said, "and then I want to go back to my table and finish my coffee, because it was very good coffee, and I didn't get to finish it." Soft laughter moved through the room. "The first thing I want to say is that I am not a remarkable person. I want to be very clear about that. The programs Olivia described tonight, the scholarships, the clinics, the job placements, those are the work of the Foundation's staff, its volunteers, its board, and most importantly, the veterans and families who used those programs and built something from what they were offered. I wrote checks. Writing checks is easy when you have the means to do it. The hard work belongs to other people." He paused. "The second thing I want to say is directed specifically to the veterans in this room and to their families." He looked at the sergeant in the wheelchair. He looked at the young couple in dress uniforms. He looked at Senator Green. "Your service is not a data point. It is not a talking point or a headline or a category on a grant application. It is the singular fact of your life that you chose, at a time when you could have chosen otherwise, to put your body and your time and your future in service to something larger than yourself. I know what that choice costs. I know because I made it myself, and I know because I watched the men and women around me make it every day for 28 years. That cost is real. It deserves a real response." The room was very quiet. "The third thing," David said, And here his voice changed slightly, became a fraction quieter, not softer in the sense of vulnerability, but quieter in the sense of precision. Is something I want to say to anyone in this room who has ever looked at another person and decided, before they had the full picture, who that person was and what they were worth. He did not look at Richard Coleman. He did not need to. I grew up in this country, he said. I grew up in the South. I know what it means to walk into a room and have someone's eyes tell you, before a single word is spoken, that you have been categorized and found insufficient. I know that experience from the inside. I have known it my entire life. He paused. I also know that experience from the outside, because I have watched it happen to others, and I have sometimes, in my younger years, been slow to challenge it in the ways I should have. He was quiet for a moment. What I learned over 28 years of service and everything that came after is that the impulse to reduce another human being to a surface is not about the person being reduced. It is never about them. It is about the fear of the person doing the reducing. The fear that if they look too closely, they might find something that disrupts the order they have arranged their world into. He placed both palms flat on the podium. The arrangement is always worth disrupting, he said. Every single time. He stepped back from the microphone. The room held its breath for 1 full second, and then it rose again. The applause continued for nearly 2 minutes, which is a long time in a room of 600 people, most of whom have other things competing for their attention. But the room did not tire of it because the room understood, in the way that rooms occasionally understand something collectively, that what had just happened was not a speech. It was a reckoning of a particular kind, quiet and precise and impossible to fully dismiss. David Brooks returned to the main table. He retrieved his coffee cup and found that Marcus had refreshed it during his absence, which caused him to look up and find the young server at the edge of the room and give him a small acknowledging nod. Marcus nodded back. Richard Coleman was seated. He had been seated since the standing ovation ended, and he had not spoken to anyone at the table since sitting down. He was looking at his dessert plate, which was empty, with the focused attention of a man who has suddenly discovered that he cannot look anywhere else. The pharmaceutical heiress beside him was speaking quietly to the executive on her other side. Senator Green had stood briefly to greet a retired general who had crossed the ballroom to congratulate him after David's speech. The normal movement of the evening was reasserting itself around the main table, the small readjustments of conversation and positioning that always follow a large moment. David sat down. He picked up his coffee. He drank it. Richard Coleman looked at him. "Mr. Brooks," he said. His voice had a different quality than it had carried for the previous 3 hours. Something had been removed from it. The particular resonance that money and long-standing social dominance give to a voice, the sense of guaranteed reception, was gone, and what was left was simply a man's voice, uncertain of its welcome. David looked at him. "I owe you an apology," Richard said. David set his coffee cup down carefully. He did not speak immediately. He had the quality that effective leaders and effective listeners share of not filling silence simply because it exists. "I made a series of assumptions this evening," Richard continued, "that were wrong, and I expressed those assumptions in ways that were disrespectful and, frankly, beneath me." He paused. Something was working its way across his face, not performance or not entirely, but something closer to the actual feeling that performance usually substitutes for. "I don't have a good explanation for why I behaved the way I did. I've been at this table 6 times and I've never acted like that before, and I think the honest answer is that I usually don't have to, because the people I make assumptions about usually aren't in a position to show me that my assumptions are wrong." The candor of this last statement surprised even him visibly. David looked at Richard Coleman with those patient, unhurried eyes, and in the look there was none of the heat that the evening might have earned, none of the satisfaction that the evening's reversal certainly offered, none of the cold precision that the moment would have permitted. There was instead the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have decided that their interest in the truth is more important than their interest in being right. "I appreciate you saying that," David said. "I mean it genuinely, not as a formality. It takes something to say what you just said." Richard nodded, looking down briefly and then back up. "Can I tell you something?" David said. "Please," Richard said. "The way you spoke to me tonight, it wasn't new. I've been hearing versions of that conversation my entire life. Before the Army, during the Army, after the Army. The specific words change. The assumption underneath them doesn't always." He let this settle for a moment. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel worse than you already feel. I'm telling you because I think it's relevant to what you said about not having an explanation. Richard listened. The explanation, David said, is that this is what unexamined assumptions do when they're never challenged. They go on operating. And the people they affect most are usually not in a position to challenge them, which means the person carrying the assumptions never has to reckon with them. He paused. Tonight, the circumstances were different. That's all. Tonight you got to see how a scene looks from a different angle. Richard was quiet for a moment. And if the circumstances had been what you actually appear to be, what you appeared to be to me when I sat down, if I had been a man with fewer resources and less of a platform, David said, the conversation would have ended the same way it started. You would have moved on to someone more interesting and I would have gone home. He held Richard's gaze, and the assumptions would have stayed exactly where you left them. Richard absorbed this. It was not a comfortable thing to absorb, but he absorbed it. What do I do with that? He asked. Not rhetorically. He was asking a real question, and the fact that he was asking it instead of deflecting was, David thought, a more promising sign than the apology itself. That's yours to figure out, David said. I can tell you what I did with it when it was my question to answer. I figured out that the only thing I could control was what I did with my own resources and my own influence. I couldn't fix the assumption. I could build something that made the assumption irrelevant. He picked up his coffee again. But I'll also tell you, David added, that the version of this conversation where the man across the table didn't have $90 million or a company or 28 years of service, that man deserved the same basic regard before any of that was known, just as a human being sitting at a table. Richard Coleman was quiet for a long moment. You're right, he said. You're right. Across the table, Senator Green had returned to his seat and was pretending to review the evening's program while listening to this exchange with the careful attention of a man who knows that the most important conversations at any event are never the ones happening at the podium. At the edge of the room, Marcus, the young server, was clearing glasses from an adjacent table with the efficient invisibility of a person who works in service at events like these and has learned that the people at the tables rarely notice him. Tonight, at this particular table, one man had used his name. He would remember that. The formal proceedings resumed after David's return to the table. A video presentation played on the large screen above the stage, a documentary montage of the Foundation's programs over the past 3 decades, footage of veterans in job training programs, children receiving scholarship notifications, a time-lapse of a mental health clinic in rural Colleton County going from empty building to fully staffed facility. The room watched with the kind of attention that comes from having just heard a story that gave the images weight they might not otherwise have carried. Senator Green spoke briefly from the podium, addressing the legislative priorities he was carrying into the next session, speaking not in the language of policy, but in the language of consequences, what it meant in practical daily terms when a veteran couldn't access mental health services, what it meant when a child grew up watching a parent struggle without institutional support. He was a good speaker, measured and unshowy, the kind of speaker who earns his moments rather than manufacturing them. Then came the pledge portion of the evening. In the Bennett Foundation's tradition, the pledge portion was not conducted through silent bidding cards or discreet envelopes passed to Foundation staff. It was conducted openly, in the room, with a simple hand-raise system, donors indicating their intentions aloud or by gesture, a practice that some organizations considered gauche, but that Olivia had always maintained was intentional. Transparency, she believed, was itself a value. If you were willing to give, you should be willing to give where people could see you, because the act of public generosity created permission for others to match it. The opening pledge was set at $100,000. Hands went up. The pharmaceutical heiress pledged $250,000. A technology executive from Atlanta pledged $500,000. A corporate group pledge came in at $750,000 from a financial services firm, represented by 2 partners at a table near the back. Senator Green, who gave what he could and had never made his personal finances a part of his public identity, pledged $25,000, which the room acknowledged warmly because everyone present understood the difference between giving proportionally and giving for show. Richard Coleman raised his hand. $1 million, he said. It was more than he had given in any of the previous 6 years. The table acknowledged it, the heiress with a nod, one of the executives with a brief word of commendation. Richard sat with the pledge in front of him and found that it felt different this time, heavier and more specific, and he was not yet sure whether that was a better feeling or simply a more honest one. David Brooks had not raised his hand during the pledge portion. Olivia was watching him from the podium, and she caught his eye, and there was a private signal exchanged in that look, the signal of 11 years of mutual understanding and a specific prior conversation. "The Foundation is also grateful," Olivia said, after the final public pledge had been recorded, "to announce a new commitment from our keynote honoree for this evening." She looked at David. "Colonel Brooks has informed the Foundation that he is establishing a new fund, the Brooks Veterans Mental Health Initiative, with an initial gift of $15 million. The fund will be administered by the Bennett Foundation and directed specifically at expanding outpatient mental health services for veterans in rural and underserved communities across the American South, with a particular focus on the counties where access to care is currently most limited." The room absorbed this number. "The fund," Olivia continued, "will operate with a 20-year commitment, with annual reviews and community input from veteran populations in each service area. Colonel Brooks has additionally committed to matching any new major gifts to the initiative dollar for the next 5 years." The room rose again, less spontaneously than before, more slowly, the way rooms rise when they have processed what they have heard and decided it deserves standing for. It was, in some ways, the more meaningful ovation of the two. At the main table, Richard Coleman stood with the room. He was looking at David Brooks with an expression that had moved past the recognition of embarrassment and into something harder to categorize, something that might, given sufficient time and honest self-examination, develop into a different way of moving through the world. David acknowledged the room again with the same unhurried nod. And then he looked at the two young officers in dress uniforms near the far wall, the couple he had noticed at the beginning of the evening, and he caught the eye of the woman among them, who was maybe 24 years old, and who had been standing with the particular posture of someone trying to take up less space than they were entitled to, and he held her gaze for a moment and gave a small, specific nod that said, "This is for you. This is about you. You belong in this room." She stood a little straighter. Her companion, a young man with a first lieutenant's bar on his shoulder, noticed the exchange and looked across the room at the man at the main table, and did not yet know everything that the evening had contained, but understood from the look on his partner's face that something real had just passed between them and that it mattered. The evening moved toward its conclusion. Dessert wine was served. Conversations reformed across the ballroom in the warm way that evenings reform after a shared experience has given them a shared reference. People who had been politely connected became, temporarily, genuinely connected by the fact of having witnessed the same thing. At the main table, the conversation had shifted. Richard Coleman was speaking with Senator Green about the legislative priorities the senator had outlined, and it was a different conversation from the kind Richard normally had at these events, less transactional, more invested, as if the evening had briefly disrupted the habit of treating every interaction as an opportunity and substituted for it the simpler practice of actually listening. David Brooks was speaking with a retired major general who had come to the table specifically to find him, a tall man in his early 70s with the bearing of a person who was given orders in situations where orders meant the difference between survival and its alternative. They were speaking quietly, and whatever they were saying was contained between them, but both men were smiling, the particular smiles of people who share a history long enough to contain things beyond words. The chandeliers of the Magnolia Grand threw their warm light evenly across all of it. Somewhere in the city outside, the April night had deepened, and the jasmine scent that had been carried on the evening breeze when the guests arrived was still present in the air, sweet and persistent, the way certain things persist that you would not have predicted to last. 3 months passed. Charleston moved through its spring and into its summer with the particular southern insistence on beauty that the heat only intensifies rather than diminishes. The harbor went on, reflecting the sky. The palmetto trees along the Battery went on bending slightly in the coastal wind. The city's oldest streets, laid out before the country they now existed within was a country, went on being walked by the full and complicated range of human beings that any old city accumulates over centuries of presence. The Brooks Veterans Mental Health Initiative had its first administrative meeting in early May. Olivia Bennett ran it from the Foundation's offices in a building on King Street, a restored 19th century commercial space with high ceilings and long windows that let in the late afternoon light. Present at the meeting, in addition to the Foundation's senior staff, were 3 veterans advocacy organizations, 2 representatives from the South Carolina Department of Veterans Affairs, a clinical psychologist who specialized in trauma-focused therapy and who had spent 12 years working in the Veterans Health Administration, and a group of 7 veterans themselves, men and women ranging in age from their late 20s to their early 60s, who had been invited not as beneficiaries of the program, but as consultants in its design. David Brooks was not in the room. He had sent a written statement that Olivia read aloud at the beginning of the meeting, which outlined his intentions and his non-negotiable principles for the fund, chief among them that the programs be designed by the populations they served and not by institutional administrators who had studied those populations from a distance. The statement ended with a line that Olivia read twice, once because it was true and once because the room needed to hear it twice. The people who have carried the hardest weight deserve more than programs designed for them by people who have never felt the ground move under their feet. The meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, the framework for the first 3 clinics had been established, one in Colleton County, one in Orangeburg County, one in a rural community in the Virginia foothills that had been identified through a needs assessment as having 0 mental health providers within a 30-mile radius. Hiring would begin within 60 days. The clinics would be operational within 8 months. None of this was announced in a press release. Richard Coleman did not attend the meeting, but 6 weeks after the gala, he had done something that none of his colleagues expected, which was that he called his foundation's director and instructed her to redirect a portion of the foundation's charitable budget away from the arts organizations and business development initiatives that had long been its primary beneficiaries and toward veteran service programs in 3 states. He did this without fanfare, in a call that lasted 11 minutes, and he did not tell anyone about it over dinner or mention it in any of the interviews he gave in the months that followed about the real estate market in the American South. He had also, in the weeks following the gala, done something else that no one saw because no one was looking. He had called his company's human resources director and told her that he wanted to review the company's hiring practices for veterans with post-service employment gaps in their resumes. He did not explain why. He simply made the request and followed up twice to ensure it was being addressed. The HR director, a practical woman who had been with the company for 17 years and had learned to receive instructions without requiring narratives to accompany them, initiated the review. It was small. It was incremental. It was nowhere near the scale of the $90 million or the $15 million fund or the 28 years or any of the other numbers that had filled the ballroom of the Magnolia Grand on an April evening. But it was real, and real things, however small, compound over time in the way that unreality cannot. Senator Greene's legislation passed out of committee in June with bipartisan support, a minor miracle in a political environment that had grown to regard bipartisan support as a species of near extinction. The bill expanded access to mental health services for veterans in rural communities through a combination of telehealth infrastructure funding and incentives for licensed practitioners to establish practices in underserved areas. It was not a perfect bill. It was a bill that had been negotiated through the normal, imperfect machinery of the legislative process and had emerged with most of its essential provisions intact. The senator signed it in a ceremony at the Columbia State House on a Wednesday morning in late June, surrounded by veterans advocates and a bipartisan group of colleagues and 2 reporters, which was not the kind of ceremony that generates wide coverage, which was perhaps appropriate for a bill that would do its most important work quietly, in communities where the cameras rarely pointed. David Brooks was not at the ceremony. He sent a brief congratulatory note to the senator's office, signed with his initials. In a rental house in Colleton County, a 43-year-old veteran named Raymond Gill was in the process of moving in. He had served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, and had come home to a county where the nearest VA facility was an hour and 40 minutes away, a distance that had proven, over the years since his discharge, to be too large to cross on the days when crossing it would have mattered most. He had been on a waiting list for outpatient mental health services for 9 months. He had learned 2 weeks prior that a new clinic would be opening in his county within 6 months, and that he would be among the first cohort of patients to access services there. He did not know who had funded the clinic. He would never know. He had a daughter who was 9 years old and who, in the particular way of 9-year-olds, had noticed that something had shifted in her father in the week since he had received the news, something that she could not name, but that she could feel in the way the house felt in the morning and in the way her father sometimes sat with her while she did her homework in the evenings and said nothing but was present in a way that felt different from the previous months. She could not have articulated what was different. She only knew that the silence had changed its quality. In a hotel conference room in Colombia, a group of 12 veterans were participating in a job readiness workshop run by one of the foundation's placement program coordinators, a woman named Angela, who had herself been an Army logistics officer for 8 years, and who brought to the work the particular combination of empathy and rigor that comes from having stood on both sides of the same experience. She was teaching a class on translating military experience into civilian employment language, which is a specific skill, the ability to render what you have done in terms that people who have not done it can understand and value. The veterans in the room ranged in age from 22 to 54 and had backgrounds ranging from infantry to signals intelligence to medical corps. They were doing a group exercise, and the room had the particular quality of people engaged in something they take seriously because the stakes are real and present. Angela had a habit at the end of each workshop of sharing one piece of advice that she found she returned to often. That evening, the piece of advice she shared was something she had heard secondhand, relayed to her by a colleague who had been at the Magnolia Grand Gala, a version of something a man at the main table had said in passing that her colleague had thought was worth repeating. She had no idea who had said it. She shared it because it was true. The advice was this: the work is not about making people see you. The work is about building something that still exists and still matters, regardless of whether anyone is looking. The 12 veterans in the room wrote it in their notebooks or typed it into their phones. One man, a former combat engineer named Charles from Sumter, looked at it for a moment after writing it and then underlined it, not because he hadn't heard similar things before, but because sometimes a thing needs to arrive at the right moment to land in the right place. He had been looking for work for 8 months. He had 3 interviews scheduled for the following week. He underlined the sentence and kept going. David Brooks, on the same evening, was in Fayetteville, North Carolina, at a small community center adjacent to Fort Liberty. He was there not as a donor or an executive or a colonel, but as a volunteer for a program that paired retiring service members with mentors who had successfully navigated the transition to civilian life. He had been doing this once a month for 4 years. He came without notice, without a media presence, without a communications team, in the same Navy suit he wore to occasions that required suits, and in the same frame of mind he brought to everything, which was the frame of mind of a man who understood that the world was made not by the people who thought about improving it, but by the people who showed up repeatedly and without ceremony to do the actual work. He sat across a folding table from a 31-year-old staff sergeant named Torres, who was 7 weeks from discharge and terrified in the quiet, disciplined way that certain kinds of strong people are terrified, with the terror organized and contained and expressed only in the precision of his questions. David answered each question with the same precision, not with reassurance, not with the polished optimism of someone selling an idea. With the honest account of a man who had been where Torres was standing and who remembered what the ground felt like there. They talked for 2 hours. When it was over, Torres walked out of the community center into the North Carolina night with nothing materially changed and everything in his posture slightly different, the difference between carrying a weight alone and carrying it with the knowledge that someone who has carried it before considers it carryable. David drove back to his hotel. It was a modest chain hotel 3 miles from the community center, not the kind of place a man with his resources needed to stay, but the kind of place that was convenient and functional, and that he had never seen any reason to upgrade from in 4 years of making this monthly trip. He ordered room service, a club sandwich, and coffee, and sat at the small desk by the window and looked out at the lights of Fayetteville for a while, before opening his laptop to review the quarterly report from the foundation. The report was thorough and detailed, and written in the careful language of people who take their accountability to donors seriously. He read it from beginning to end. He made 3 notes in the margin of his printed copy, small questions about program metrics and service access timelines that he would raise with Olivia in their next call. At the bottom of the final page, there was a brief paragraph that the report's author had added almost as an afterthought, a note about the community response to the Colleton County Clinic announcement, drawn from a short feedback survey sent to the county's Veterans Advocacy Network. The paragraph summarized the responses and then included one direct quote from a veteran who had asked to remain anonymous, which read, "I didn't know anyone was paying attention out here. Now I do." David Brooks read this sentence twice. He closed the report. He looked out the window for a while at the lights of a city that was going on being itself, with all the indifferent and essential vitality that cities maintain regardless of what any individual within them is feeling or deciding or quietly building toward. Then he turned off the desk lamp and went to sleep. In Charleston, South Carolina, at the Magnolia Grand Hotel, the ballroom where 600 people had gathered in April was now configured for a corporate conference scheduled to begin in the morning. The tables had been rearranged, the chandeliers dimmed, the floral arrangements replaced with corporate banners and registration materials. The Vienna crystal still caught what light remained. The marble floors still reflected the ceiling above them. The room did not know what had happened within it 3 months ago, because rooms do not know things. But the people who had been in it carried what had happened the way people carry things that arrive at the right moment in their lives, not always consciously, not always verbalized, but present in the choices they made in the weeks and months that followed, in the small recalibrations of behavior and attention that accumulate over time into something that resembles, in however modest and imperfect a form, a changed understanding of the world. Somewhere in Colleton County, a 9-year-old girl was asleep in a house where the silence had changed its quality. Somewhere in Columbia, a man named Charles had 3 interviews scheduled and 1 sentence underlined in his notebook. Somewhere in Fayetteville, a staff sergeant named Torres was rehearsing answers to questions he had written down at a folding table across from a man he had never met before that evening and whose name he would not forget. And in a hotel room 3 miles from Fort Liberty, a man who had spent 28 years serving a country that had not always treated him as it should, and who had spent the years since building something that helped the people he had served alongside, and who asked for nothing in return for any of it, was sleeping the sleep of someone who has done on a given day what the day required. No more, no less. Exactly that.